Holly, you're an artist, of course, a musician as well. You're also working as a scientist. You're working on a PhD. You're a doctoral student at Stanford University's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. You're based in San Francisco, California. You're like in different systems. Your work is perceived in popular culture as well as in media art, of course, in the art world. You received your MFA in electronic music and recording media at Mills College, and you won the Elizabeth Mills Carruthers Award for Best Composer.
It's weird to have my resume read to me when I'm sitting on stage.
Just being polite. And yeah, your latest album, A Platform, which was published this year, caused a lot of positive reactions. It was like really lauded internationally by the critique, and I'm really happy to see your performance tonight. So let's start with a little maybe associative question to open up a little bit the field. We talked today a lot about the human body, about affect and emotions, also about the difference between emotion and affect. We talked about data doubles in the internet. We also talked about this notion of transparency. So a lot of topics which are also reflected in your work as an artist, in your album and your music as well. And maybe as a first question, as a composer, as a musician, is there anything like a sound of data? And what could that be like, the sound of data?
This is something I've thought about a lot. And I think, if you asked someone maybe 20 years ago, it would have been lots of repetition and lots of multiples and kind of like an overwhelming stream of abstract sounds and probably a corresponding visual. And I think one of the things that's changed in a lot of the work of artists that I admire is that there's definitely a more kind of emotional aspect or a more personal aspect to the way that we're thinking about how data sounds or what data looks like. So I would say it sounds like, our conversations that we have on the phone. It looks like our videos. It looks like our Vines. It looks like our Instagram. So it's kind of like just little snippets of our lives, really. I'm starting to try to see data and deal with it more as kind of like a personal snapshot and something that can kind of create a narrative about a person, and it can also create a very false narrative about someone, which is also kind of the danger in how we use it and how we collect it and these kind of things.
We talked a lot during the conference about possible utopias, which are like intertwined with technologies, network technologies, and technologies of collecting, storing, and analyzing, let's say, data, and also about the dystopias that are also intertwined with it. And one interesting point in one of the last presentations was this notion of a false binary, a false dichotomy between good and evil when we talk about like these technologies of data storing and analyzing. So where do you position yourself as an artist, your practices in this question, in this field, but in this dichotomy?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think that's in the program and the opening statement, this kind of like false dilemma, false dichotomy. I've seen some articles about myself, and it's like techno-utopian from San Francisco, and I'm like, oh my God, like, I never called myself that. I don't know why I'm being called that. So yeah, I think we like to have these kind of like oversimplifications and understanding where people are coming from. But also in terms of electronic music and that field that I'm very active in, we also have a tendency toward looking at the negative aspects or the dystopia. I was having a conversation with Jace Clayton, who's an artist based in New York, last week for the Ableton conference, and I can't remember the exact statistic that he said, so don't quote me on this, but he was talking about how science fiction written in the last 20 years, some overwhelming percentage, like 90% is dystopian, or 95, some overwhelming statistic. And I think it's something that, in the creative world, sometimes it's easier to imagine, it's like harder to imagine something positive or it's more difficult to imagine what we could do to make things better. It's much easier to kind of imagine if everything just went to shit, because that's kind of this perspective that's almost easier when we use our imaginations. And so I think also we're just total products of, or somewhat, not I shouldn't say total, but we're somewhat products of of where we've grown up and who we've been influenced by. And I grew up in the South in the United States, and it's a very kind of like, sometimes blindly optimistic part of the world, but that kind of optimism has somehow stayed a large part of my personality, even though I've experienced much more past the South, since growing up there. But that kind of sense of optimism has definitely stayed with me, and so I am generally optimistic that people care about these issues, and that there are smart people working on them, and that in order to kind of solve a lot of the problems that we're dealing with, we have to be hopeful that there is a solution. I think if we just kind of like give up and let in and just always veer toward the dystopian, I think that kind of stops a lot of problem solving. And I'm not talking about this kind of like Bay Area solutionism where it's like, oh, let's just make an app for that and then ding, it's solved. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about like actually saying that there could be an alternative to the situation that we have, and finding the right community to help work together and make those changes.
Our conference reflects some of the topics which are addressed in platform. Could you talk a little bit about the concept of platform and some of the topics that you addressed, like surveillance in the album?
That's a huge question. I feel like I've been talking about platform for like the last 6 months, but I will try to say something interesting about it. So platform was definitely like a group effort. So my first album, Movement, was kind of very solitary. I was kind of working through issues of electronic music performance. I was dealing with the laptop as the most personal instrument. I was, at the time I was at Mills. This is like 2010. It seems like so far in the past, but people were still having this conversation about whether or not the laptop was an instrument and whether or not it was boring to see people perform with a laptop. And so I was kind of like working through a lot of those issues and trying to bring the voice into that to answer some of those questions. So it was a very kind of like solitary process. And then with platform, I really wanted to kind of turn the practice outward a little bit and have it be less kind of inward just to myself. And so I decided to collaborate with a bunch of people. I collaborated with Matt Dryhurst, my partner, and I collaborated with Metahaven and Colin Self, who's also here, and tons of other amazing artists in kind of an effort to, have more of an outward focus. And also I really wanted to try to use the vessel of an album release. This is something that I kind of learned over the last couple of years, is that, I released Chorus as a video and as a single, and I released Home, and it's really weird being part of this what feels like an ancient industry, the music industry. It's like it really is a difficult industry to get to kind of like move forward and adopt new ways of doing things. So it's really just like everything revolves around the album cycle, which was this really weird kind of eye-opening to me. No one really wants to talk about your work unless you have this grand album statement. So I was like, okay, well, if we do have this grand album release, how can that be used in a different way? How can we use like kind of like the pop vessel as a way to talk about other things? Also trying to kind of break down this idea of the lone icon or like the lone genius in a studio somewhere, like coming up with this great new vision of the world, and kind of more thinking about the community of ideas where there are so many different philosophers and theorists and other artists that I'm inspired by and that I'm reading, and so I really wanted to try to, especially around kind of like the press for the album, I wanted to try to talk about other people and try to point people to other people's work and talk about how it's actually a community of people that move ideas and thoughts forward.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to.
All right, tangent.
I'd like to talk a little bit more with you about the pop vessel or about the pop motive. I remember a quote, you were quoted in a German newspaper in Taz, in the Tageszeitung, saying that when our human relations are mediated and we like break up with someone in Skype or through Skype, then we need like a different kind of pop song to reflect these kind of affects and emotions. And could you elaborate on that, on what could these new forms or vessels be like?
Yeah, well, actually, Matt came up with that like a really nice phrase. Pop music as a carrier signal. So to have pop music or to have like a love song or a format that's familiar, but to be able to use that as a carrier signal and embed that with something that has a second meaning or another layer. So that was kind of the idea behind Home. You know, it was one of the first times I'd really been working with lyrics. So I've been trying to think a lot over the past several years in terms of production process, how to make a track or how to make a piece be embedded with the ideas behind the piece itself. So I think, you know, one really kind of direct way of dealing with different kind of conceptual ideas when you're making music, because music is already an abstraction. So, you know, one really clear way is with lyrics. So, okay, great, that's one thing that I can use, but I also wanted to figure out how I could use kind of production techniques as well. And so Matt came up with this really great process called net concrete that deals with this idea of surveillance, which is self-surveillance. So you can kind of spy on yourself and record your own browsing activity, and then you can kind of chop that together into a kind of music concrete or net concrete soundscape. And I've used that a lot in, you know, in a lot of my percussive hits or, you know, just general sound design, especially for home and chorus. So I really wanted the track to be embedded with the concept behind the track and not just the lyric. But I think what you're saying in terms of kind of like new mediated experiences needing new sounds is something that really resonates, because, you know, I feel like often, especially in music, we have a tendency toward the nostalgic, because nostalgia can kind of like immediately kind of pluck the heartstrings or get that kind of emotional response that you want. But I think it's really important that when we have, you know, new emotions and new modes of communication, that we also find new aesthetics to communicate those new feelings. So one example that I like to give is, like, you know, breaking up face to face is very different than breaking up via text message with some emoji at the end where you're like, what does that even mean? Or, you know, like, how I don't know how to feel about that. Like, these are actually new emotions, I think, that because they're mediated in such a different way. These ways that we're interacting with each other. And so, sorry, I have like a frog in my throat. So yeah, trying to find a new aesthetic or something that sounds like today, or that can really kind of capture that, is something that I've been really obsessed with. And I think sometimes I'm more successful than other times. And it doesn't mean that like every sound has to be, you know, you can't reference the past at all. Like, of course, I'm drawing from like dance music, you know, tropes and aesthetics from, you know, the last 40 years. And, you know, I'm using like a Western musical scale. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about trying to make things speak to today on today's kind of terms.
And of course, as well, like the emotion to break up with a computer as well. It could be something new. Huh? It's interesting that you talk about your relationship with your computer and your music a lot, and there seems to be a kind of love, but also frustration and depression. Can you elaborate on that? Or can you talk about that?
Well, I think a lot of this started when I was kind of trying to advocate so much for the laptop as an instrument. So I started really thinking about what makes the laptop different from other instruments, or why are people having such a hard time accepting this instrument, and what do I think is special about it. And so I really started thinking about how it mediates so much of our lives, how it knows so much about us. And, you know, that's one of the lyrics in Home is, I know that you know me better than I know me. And that's, you know, that's also terrifying, you know? So it's like you're talking about before, this false dichotomy. It's like we love these tools and we love these machines, but they also have pitfalls, of course. And we're also kind of like learning, we're having to kind of rethink our ethics, and we're trying to, you know, we're having to decide all of these new problems that we're faced with. So yeah, it's a complicated relationship. It's like, you know, Facebook status. It's complicated.
I think we are all really excited to see your performance tonight. I'd like to ask the audience if you have questions for Holly. Any questions right now? Okay, then maybe one last question from me.
That was really fast. Has it been 30 minutes already? Wow, okay.
It's 20, I think.
Okay. It's been a long day, and everyone's ready for cocktail hour.
You talk a lot about, or let's frame it this way. Your voice is a really important element in your music, an important factor, and you blend it with these kind of electronic textures. How do you see, and how is like the human body versus technology, or the human body plus technology reflected in your music?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of writing on this as well, as like woman plus machine, or this kind of like these funny tropes that you come across. But yeah, I mean, this is something that I was thinking about also when I was trying to figure out how to make laptop music more embodied, trying to figure out how to make it more engaging and embodied for the audience. And I was really thinking about it as kind of like an extension of ourselves. And I still kind of see it that way. It's actually been incredibly liberating as someone who has, a fine voice, but it's not, I'm not like an opera singer or anything. To be able to kind of take my voice and the own limitations of my physical body, and to be able to decide how I want it to sound, and be able to make it sound ugly, and be able to make it sound beautiful, and to be able to sound like a man if I want to, or just to be able to kind of like transcend my physical form has been really empowering, I would say. So yeah, I guess it's like an extension or an augmentation in some ways. It's something that I've thought about in terms of like our digital selves, or our avatars. So I did a piece with Hannes Grassiger, I guess about a year ago, for Dis magazine, called Minisong. And so he's been writing a lot about having kind of like a digital bill of rights. So we have rights over our physical bodies, but we don't have those same rights over our digital selves. And if those are really kind of emotional extensions of ourselves, which I believe they are, then they should also be protected in some way. And so he wrote the text, and I made kind of like a medieval kind of sound collage to go under that, where I play the data, the big data, or the service provider, and he plays the user, and it's kind of like this. Also, again, I guess I fall back on like the love song, or the pining relationship again. But yeah, that's something that I've thought about a lot, as kind of like having some sort of protection or ownership over our personal selves online. And also, this was something that came up with the piece that I did with Colin Self, as we were thinking about kind of like, neo-digital feudalism, these kind of topics, and thinking about this Joan of Arc kind of like martyr martyr character, and that's kind of who Colin's playing in that piece. But yeah, I totally went off on a tangent on that. Did I answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for your time. We will see you on stage tonight at 10:30. We're really excited.
Me too.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again.
Thanks,
Holly Herndon.
Yay!